Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. I'm pleased to have Zosia Zaks join me on today's episode to discuss critical disability theory and what being neurodiversity affirming truly means. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Zosha, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I wanted to start off by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
That's an excellent question. And I can think of a couple of ways that I could answer it. But the way I'll answer it right now is a little story. I had gotten diagnosed at last. I was in my early 30s, and I heard about Autreat, which was a gathering by and for autistic people. And this was the late 90s. And at that time, the gluten free, dairy free diet was extremely popular. It was the big buzz. Everyone was trying it. And I went to Autry, and I remember just getting there and getting acclimated and standing by the dining hall and trying to collect, the program guide and figure out everything that was happening. And Jim Sinclair came rolling up, and I was not doing the gluten-free, dairy-free diet. I didn't have an idea like, oh, let me eat some food and then I'll be cured per se, but I was just trying to figure things out. So I had said to him, because I knew the menu was vegetarian, I was like, do you also do gluten-free and dairy-free options? And he said, yes, but he seemed to want to say more about it. So I kind of looked at him and was like, do a lot of people do that diet here? And he was like, actually, a lot of people at Autry say that, well, if a grilled cheese sandwich makes me autistic, bring me more grilled cheese sandwiches. And that was my introduction to autistic community and embracing who we are and reveling in who we are instead of feeling like horrible and this is a toxic thing to have, then it's got to be fixed. And that was my big introduction to that sort of empowerment perspective. But technically, okay, if I can go back, even when I was a kid, teachers were saying to my parents, we think Zosia is autistic. But back then, this was in the late 60s, early 70s, our ideas about autism keep changing. So our ideas were very narrow, and the response was, I mean, basically, well, Zosia talks, so Zosia can't possibly be autistic. So I had various struggles at various times, but yeah, I didn't get diagnosed until I was in my 30s.
And for the record, I must say, grilled cheese is delicious.
It is.
Now, you're already very educated in that you have a bachelor's degree in history, a master's in rehab counseling, but you're currently getting your PhD in human development and family studies. Why did you decide to get your PhD specifically in human development and family studies?
Well, I have always been fascinated with human beings and how human beings learn and grow and become people who live in groups and live in societies. And I've always been very dissatisfied, though, when you look at the traditional theories of human development, at least the Eurocentric theories of human development that are taught in schools. And you say, okay, well, they'll say, okay, a baby is born and they're quote unquote normal, and this is what normal development is. They go through this and then they go through that. And then you ask, well, what about disabled children or, neurodivergent children? and they'll just say, oh, well, they lack typical development. Their development's abnormal, but they never say what it is in and of itself. It's just defined as the absence of something else. And that bothers me because that's never a good definition. You know I don't have the same thing as other people, so what do I have? You know, I had discovered, a lot of people have heard of a gentleman named Vygotsky who was Russian and working in the 1920s and the early 1930s in Marxist Russia. And they may have heard of his zone of proximal development and a couple of other of his ideas that have gotten very popular in education. But a lot of them don't know about his theory of disability development. When I read it, I was almost falling out of my chair because it's just a very, very different viewpoint on disability as a diversity. And I learned more about sociocultural theory of development. And I'm just so surprised that that's not prominent in discussions. And so if I can do some work to bring this forward, I think it can make a big difference for children and adults who are disabled, their families, people who work for them, and make some positive difference.
Now, I'm interested in your experience in rehab counseling. Found in many cases, those counselors might not always have a great understanding about the autistic experience. So, what are some things rehab counselors should know to help autistics have better outcomes in employment?
Okay, well, first I'll say I do think many rehabilitation counselors do have an idea around self-determination that's good. The focus really has always been, okay, what do you want to achieve and how can professional people support you in achieving that? So there are some strengths, but I think that the traditional model in rehabilitation counseling, they started working with people who have sensory disabilities like blindness, physical disabilities, people coming back from wars who maybe had amputations. So who was in vocational rehabilitation spaces and asking for services changed over the decades. And I think in that sense, maybe the model has been trying to catch up. When you're talking about people who, when we get into autism and employment, I mean, this is a huge, we could talk about this all day. Generally speaking, what autistic people need in vocational rehabilitation is almost opposite to what they focus on. They tended to focus for a long time on what we call task training. Okay, so if you have one arm, how are you going to use a typewriter? If you can't see, how are you going to operate a cash register? If you can't stand up all day, what jobs can you do? And can you sort the mail seated? Okay, so it's very like task oriented. Autistic people tend not to have a problem with tasks, okay, but by and large, where they can learn the tasks. That's not the issue. It's more all the other components of work, like being there with other people, self-regulation, self-advocacy, communication, understanding the hidden rules of the workplace. And it wasn't really designed to address those. So I think rehabilitation counselors can do is just widen their idea of an accommodation. An accommodation is not always going to be an adapted telephone or braille. Accommodation could be, providing someone with that hidden social curriculum in a workplace, or, teaching self-advocacy skills, providing education for both autistic people and the non-autistic people they're going to work with, which I was going to get to in some of the other questions you're going to ask. So I'll put the point out there and then maybe we can explore it more, which is that I don't think it's always that the autistic person has to do all the changing. We can also, for example, provide education to other employers and employees about human difference, and that can be very helpful too.
You've taught a graduate and undergraduate course on autism and disability studies, I believe, for over a decade, using a social justice lens. What are the principles of social justice you think it's important to focus on as it relates to autism and disability studies?
Well, there's a few points that I can think of. I mean, the first that comes to my mind, which is really important, and we've been paying more attention to this lately, is intersectionality. So, in feminist standpoint theory, who you are in society matters. Okay, so we know now that women and girls tend to have different experiences of autism. Okay, your experience, if you experience multiple marginalizations because of racism, for example, or classism, so how you're going to be experiencing your autism and intersecting with systems, for example, clinical systems or special education or the justice system, that's going to be different. So we really want to be inclusive of a wide range of autism experiences. I think that's the first thing. The second thing, too, is that sometimes, going back to that employment question, we focus on helping out of frameworks that we already use. So we think employment success is waking up in the morning, going to a job, getting paid to do that job, coming home, using your salary to pay for your house. And there are autistic people who have identified wanting to hold down a typical job as their goal, and we want to honor that. There can be great benefits that come from working, including community with your colleagues, feeling important, you're doing something for society. But if we stop there, we never get to question why we work the way that we do. So that's that critical disability theory lens that I think is important, because you can have a disability studies course that doesn't question society at all. And I really want to know, why do we have to work the way that we work? Why do we define worker a certain way? Can there be different kinds of workers? Also, why do we tie success to employment? I mean, all of these questions are very important to explore. So I think that's those two pieces, the intersectional lens, which is so important, and including diverse voices and diverse understandings and diverse priorities and needs. And then the other piece is that critical thinking, critical disability theory lens, so that we're not forgetting to ask those deeper why questions.
I love where you were talking about why do we attach success to employment, because one of the first things when you meet a new person, a lot of times as an adult they'll ask you what you do,
Mm-hmm.
and why is my value specifically related to my job, my employment, my career, however someone wants to frame it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Or, when we go back a minute and we think about workplace accommodations, so we'll think, okay, well, maybe they need the task training, right, to do a certain job. Or when they go to work, sensory accommodations come to mind. We can change the light bulbs around. But a lot of times, what I have felt over the years of doing this is what autistic and other neurodivergent workers often really need is what I call social accommodations. And what I mean by that is, let's say somebody goes into work and they sit down and they're doing their tasks right away. They get focused. They don't say hi to anybody in the morning. They're not so interested in what you did on the weekend. They may get up to eat at some point, but they just eat and then they're done and they go back to work. And in working with non-autistic people, sometimes, not always, here I'm not trying to say all non-autistic people are very judgmental, but oftentimes there can be a feeling in a workplace like, how come that guy doesn't say hello to us? Or how come she doesn't have lunch with everybody? Oh, she must not like us. Oh, she must not like it here. Or, oh, she must not be that friendly. When they're just working. So can we have some new social ideas about people that are more respectful to different ways of being? And to say, okay, I can work with this person. They walk in the morning. They're not necessarily like, oh, hi, how are you? Well, oh, yeah, the Ravens won. Oh, yeah, yeah. But that doesn't mean that they're not a friendly person or an interesting person or someone great to work with. That's what I want, is to ask those deeper questions. Like, why do we say people have to be a certain way? Why do we say that workers have to act a certain way or have a certain suite of behaviors that we consider a team player? There's many ways to contribute to a team and to be part of a group. And I want us to always be thinking about that. So sometimes that's what I mean. It's not necessarily that the autistic person, has to do everything. Non-autistic people can widen their ideas.
Currently, you work as an autism consultant helping schools, companies, and organizations develop neurodiversity affirming practices and procedures. So, neurodiversity affirming has, maybe in some ways, at least to me, turned into somewhat of a buzzword. So, what are some of these practices and procedures that truly determines if an organization or person, for that matter, is neurodiversity affirming?
This is a good question. And it's hard to answer succinctly because there's so many different kinds of organizations. So neurodiversity affirming practice at a school, for example, is going to look very different than, say, in an industrial warehouse, which is going to look very different than, say, if you're in a tea shop, in a quiet part of Greenwich Village. So, it's very hard to say this is the one thing. But I think if I could distill it down, what I think makes something authentically neurodiversity affirming is when non autistic people are comfortable getting uncomfortable. And by that, I mean, is just as I was saying in my last answer to the previous question, for non autistic people, it may be very uncomfortable to consider different ways of being or to accept different kinds of social behavior or to bridge that gap. And I think that willingness to say, okay, you know what? That really is just my narrow idea. Let me get comfortable with being uncomfortable and stretch. And I think that that's really what I'm looking for.
I know for me, being autistic, one of the themes when I think about neurodiversity affirming practices and procedures is safety. I know you've taught other autistic people about strategies to keep ourselves safe in regards to social danger for a long time now. Do you see those strategies connecting with neurodiversity practices and procedures?
I hadn't thought about it really in a very direct way until you asked that question. But I do see how it relates in the sense that I want to honor like the efforts that a lot of organizations and workplaces and schools are expending to be neurodiversity affirming. That being said, it's the same problem that other marginalized groups can run into, which is that I'll complain about something or I'll feel that something is ableist or I'll feel that, as an autistic person, I'm not really being given leadership opportunities. And I'll mention this because a lot of times too, discrimination is inadvertent, it's implicit, okay? But we'll say, that we're running into some barriers or some problems, and we get a response like, oh, well, we're doing all these things to be neurodiversity affirming. So what's your problem? So how this connects to safety, I think, is not so much safety as in walking down the street and being aware of possibly dangerous situations. But now I'm thinking in terms of personal, mental health kinds of safety to take care of yourself. And you know what you feel. And if you're walking in every day and feeling like people are just not understanding you as an autistic person and not listening to yourself, so the things that you as a self advocate are saying that you need in terms of accommodations or in terms of making opportunities equitable, that's valid. And to reach out for help and to get support around that so you don't get burnt out. And the other thing too that happens sometimes for us is that an organization will be like, oh, well, we have to be neurodiversity affirming, so we'll get like one self advocate over here to give us like little pieces of advice or something. And it can feel like, oh, this is great that they're inviting me and want to hear what I have to say. But then it can also be like, well, really, like, why am I the only one here if you're really opening up this organization to diversity? Again, watching your own personal stress level. I think it's okay if it feels good and you want to go into the organization, the workplace, the hospital, the school, and share your opinions as an autistic person if that feels good for you and they are really listening. But if it's stressing you out and you're feeling like it's just lip service, it's okay to be like, I don't think that this is really authentic and I'm worried about how I'm going to feel. So I don't want to be involved, and to give yourself that permission to identify, where you're seeing discrimination or where you're not seeing an authentic effort.
And how can our listeners learn more about you and your consulting work beyond this interview?
Well, I have a website that you can go to and you can connect to me there. It's autismability.info. I think that came into the transcript, but I can also write it down for you, Doug, and you can share it.
Yeah,
Share
definitely.
the link.
We'll share a link with everyone for with the podcast description for this episode for sure. And Zosha, I always love talking to you. I'm always learning something from you each time we talk. So thanks so much for making time to talk with me today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me in. I appreciate it. And I mean, the good news is I believe we are making a difference by doing projects like this. So I appreciate you and all the interviews that you've done.
Thanks so much to Zosha for the conversation. To learn more about Zosha, check out the link in the podcast description of this episode. At Autism Personal Coach, we provide customized coaching for autistics to help improve the quality of our lives. All of our coaches are either autistic or autistic selected for their commitment to trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming strategies. They deeply understand about burnout, sensory needs, executive functioning, and the importance of special interests. If you're interested in learning more about our coaching, please visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.